Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company which I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our first 2025 tour is now live for bookings. Titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, this incredible 8-day-long experience will take in many of the most significant historic sites in England, from Hampton Court Palace to Hatfield House, the Tower of London, to a 2-night overnight stay in Hever Castle, featuring historians including Professor Simon Thurley, CBE, Dr. Elizabeth Norton, Illyri Lynn and Claire Martin. In September, we will also be launching our July 2025 tour, which will be quite unlike any other tour that we're hosting, titled 1502, the year that shook the Tudor throne, on progress with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. This tour will take us out of the traditional heartland of London and the South East into the stunning English Cotswolds and South Wales, visiting sites including Raglan Castle, Berkeley Castle and a 2-night stay in the breathtaking Thornbury Castle. To discover more on this and secure your place on one of our live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Henry VIII had 3 royal nieces, and yet where Margaret Douglas and Frances Brandon are relatively well-known figures of the time, his 3rd niece, Eleanor Clifford, Countess of Cumberland, is all but unknown, despite her royal blood and the importance of her place in the line of succession. She was the 3rd child and 2nd daughter of Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk, and Princess Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France and the younger sister of Henry VIII. Her older sister, Lady Frances Brandon, was the mother of the famous Grey sisters, including the 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey. Despite her proximity to the crown and the difficulty this often placed on people in such a position, Eleanor led a mostly happy and successful life, although one that was snuffed out quite soon. And yet her story is all but overlooked. So who actually was she? Who did she marry? Did she have any formal role at the court? Well, today I will explore all of this and more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, Eleanor Clifford, Countess of Cumberland, Henry VIII's lost niece. Eleanor was born sometime between 1518 and 1521. Sadly, we don't actually have a confirmed date of birth for her, despite her royal status. Her name was also reasonably unusual for the time. There is, of course, the very famous Eleanor of Aquitaine from 4 centuries earlier, but Tudor royal women were nearly always Mary, Elizabeth, Anne, or Jane. She was possibly named for Eleanor of Austria, the Queen of Portugal and France, and the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Eleanor's father was Henry VIII's bestie, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and her mother, as I said a moment ago, was the king's younger, beautiful sister, Mary Tudor, one-time and short-lived Queen of France. It is most likely that Eleanor was born in the family home of Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk. Eleanor and her older sister Frances received an education appropriate to their status as extended members of the royal family and the daughters of a duke. There is also some circumstantial evidence which suggests that Eleanor could speak and write French. When Eleanor's sister Frances married Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, in March 1533, Eleanor was then betrothed to Lord Henry Clifford, the eldest son of the Earl of Cumberland, who was also distantly related to Henry VIII, giving him a tincture of royal blood. When their mother, Princess Mary, died in June 1533, both Eleanor and her elder sister attended the funeral, where Frances, as the elder, acted as chief mourner. Eleanor's fiancé, Henry Clifford, was also in attendance. On the eve of Anne Boleyn's coronation, Henry Clifford was made a Knight of the Bath. He was described as being tall and slender with dark hair. He was also very well educated, had built a superb library, and had several hobbies, including alchemy and astrology, things that were deemed relatively unusual for a nobleman of the time. He also had a role in the household of Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. Eleanor and Henry were married in the summer of 1535 in London in the Church of St Mary Overies, now incorporated into the Cathedral of Southwark. King Henry VIII was in attendance at the wedding. In celebration of the wedding, Henry Clifford's father, the Earl of Cumberland, built additions to Skipton Castle for the couple to then occupy. These included a long gallery extension and 2 towers, one of them octagonal, which was quite unusual for the time. The renovations were made in less than 4 months, and the newlyweds spent the early years of their marriage there. It was highly unusual at the time for a couple of Eleanor and Henry's rank to have their own establishment whilst their parents were still alive. And despite the splendid arrangements made for them at Skipton, Henry and Eleanor seemed to have resided mainly at Brockham Castle until Henry succeeded to his father's earldom. In 1536, Eleanor served as chief mourner at Catherine of Aragon's funeral. It seems odd that her elder sister Frances was not called upon to perform this duty. Perhaps Henry VIII thought that his cast-off wife did not merit the higher-ranking sister. Or perhaps Frances, who had been married in 1533 and whose first 2 children had died young, was pregnant with what was one of these 2 sons or was recovering from the birth of one of them. Neither sister seems to have been closely connected with the king's second marriage to Anne Boleyn, perhaps because of their mother's famously strong dislike for Anne. Eleanor would give birth to 2 sons, Henry and Charles, and a daughter named Margaret, who was born in 1540. She would go on to marry Henry Stanley, 4th Earl of Derby, and lived as late as 1596. During the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, Eleanor and her family were in significant danger. The rebels were swirling around Skipton Castle. Eleanor's husband and father refrained from joining in with the rebels. In fact, her husband played a major role during the crisis. He was responsible for rallying the townsmen of the city of Carlisle in the far northwest of England, in the county of what is now Cumbria but back then was known as Cumberland. It was clear that Skipton would come under siege, and the family did what it could to fortify the castle. Eleanor's father-in-law sent her and her attendants, her sisters-in-law and her son, to Bolton Abbey for safety, which was about 10 miles from Skipton. By October of 1536, Skipton was under siege. The renegades were unable to bring down the castle, but they heard that Eleanor was at Bolton and made their way there and forced their way into the abbey. They took Eleanor, one of her sons, and her sisters-in-law captive. They were held hostage and treated with extreme severity. The rebels sent a message to Eleanor's father-in-law, threatening to place them before the insurgents who were storming Skipton Castle. They said that if the castle wasn't surrendered, that they would then hand the young women over to the lowest camp followers, and the threat there being that they would then be abused and potentially even raped. The Earl was enraged that the king's niece was being mistreated and left immediately for Bolton. He entered the rebel camp and negotiated the release of the women and his grandson. Everyone returned to Skipton and the siege of the castle was abandoned 5 days later. Following this terrifying experience, Eleanor appears to have lived a relatively quiet life, well away from the court, which perhaps explains why her story is so seldom explored. She is not mentioned as being present at the christening of Henry VIII's long-awaited heir, Prince Edward, nor does she appear to have been one of the ladies of Jane Seymour's funeral in 1537, or in the list of senior ladies of the court who greeted Anne of Cleves upon her arrival into England, although her sister Frances was present at both occasions, and her father and stepmother were also prominent in welcoming Anne of Cleves to England. Perhaps Eleanor was in ill health or pregnant. At some point, the Duke of Suffolk wrote to the Earl of Cumberland, saying, "And understanding that my daughter Clifford can never have good health at Rich Abbey, I desire you, my lord, that you would be contented that your son, my Lord Clifford, and my said daughter may have your castle at Brockham, as they have had aforetime, where they may be and continue for such season as they shall think most convenient, for the more confirmation of both their healths, wherein you shall do me and them great pleasure. The old Earl of Cumberland died in 1542, and Eleanor's husband inherited his titles. Thereafter she became known as the Countess of Cumberland. Shortly afterwards, Eleanor and Henry lost their 2 sons. Their second son, Charles, died as a baby, and their elder son, Henry, named after his father, died at about the age of 3. He was buried in the family vault in Skipton Church, next door to his infant baby brother. Eleanor suffered another loss in 1545 when her father, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, died. In his will, he left both his daughters, Eleanor and Frances, £200 worth of plate each. As with Henry's earlier queens, there is no indication that Eleanor was part of Anne of Cleves or Catherine Howard's households. She and her sister Frances, however, were both listed in 1546 as 2 of the ladies ordinary attendant upon Catherine Parr, who were accustomed to be lodged within the king's house. Eleanor also got along very well with her stepmother, Catherine Willoughby. Given her position as a niece of the king, she is listed as a frequent recipient of New Year's and other holiday gifts from Henry VIII. Eleanor's faith is difficult to pin down, given the scarcity of information about her. However, it seems likely that she had reformist leanings, given her sister's interest in religious reform. It is also possible that she knew and had met Anne Askew, the Protestant preacher who became famous for being one of only 2 women tortured in the Tower of London. In his treatise of 3 conversions of England, published in 1604, Robert Parsons claimed that Anne Askew was accused of finding means to enter with the principal of the land, namely the Queen Catherine Parr herself, and with the king's nieces, the daughters of the Duke of Suffolk. As other ladies in the Queen's household were connected with Anne Askew, it is possible that Eleanor and Frances were indeed approached by her, although nothing indicates whether either sister was receptive. Towards the end of Henry VIII's life, he made updates to his will to make it clear what his intentions would be for the succession. Naturally, his son, Prince Edward, was heir apparent, but the king did nonetheless stipulate who would come thereafter, and it was a list, Edward aside, purely of women. Eleanor was 8th in the line of succession, behind Edward, his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, and then Eleanor's elder sister Frances and her 3 daughters, the ladies Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey. Henry VIII's elder sister, Princess Margaret, and all of her line were entirely overlooked. During the reign of Edward VI, there is evidence that Eleanor was a regular visitor to Bradgate Park, the home of her sister and her nieces. It would seem that she was also on good terms with her cousin Mary, Henry VIII's elder daughter, for both she and Frances Grey received New Year's gifts from the princess. Only one letter of Eleanor's has survived, which she wrote to her husband towards the start of 1547. She says, "To Henry Clifford, Dear heart, after my most hearty commendations, this shall be to certify you that since your departure from me I have been very sick, and at this present my water is very red, whereby I suppose I have the jaundice and the ague both. For I have none abide, i.e. I have no appetite, for meat, and I have such pains in my side and towards my back as I had at Brockham, where it began with me first. Wherefore I desire you to help me to a physician, and that this bearer might bring with him, for now in the beginning I trust I may have good remedy, and the longer it is delayed, the worse it will be. Also my sister Powys, Anne Brandon, is come to me and very desirous to see you, which I trust shall be the sooner at this time, and thus Jesus send us both health. At my lodge at Carlton on the 14th of February, and dear heart, I pray you send for Dr. Stevens, for he knoweth best my complexion for such causes. By your assured loving wife, Eleanor Cumberland." As can be heard in this letter, Eleanor had fallen ill, and despite her place in Henry VIII's line of succession and the overhaul that Edward VI made to it at the end of his reign, Eleanor did not live long enough to see the repercussions that this would have had for her grey nieces or of her own daughter, for she died in the same year as her uncle, the king. At her death, she was aged approximately 28 and had died at Brockham Castle towards the end of November 1547, although the complete peerage gives her date of death, without citing a source, as September of 1547. The Countess was buried at Holy Trinity Church in Skipton. In the 17th century, Eleanor's tomb was opened and her skeleton was examined. It was found to be in perfect condition and indicated that she was very tall and had a broad frame. She was described as having the typical chestnut hair of the Tudors. Eleanor's widower, Henry Clifford, turned his attention away from his books and his alchemy in 1554 to remarry. His second wife was Anne, the daughter of William III Baron Dacre. She bore him 2 sons, George and Francis, who became the 3rd and 4th Earls of Cumberland. Before this, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had approached the Earl about a marriage between Northumberland's 4th son, Guildford Dudley, to the Earl's sole surviving child by Eleanor, their daughter Margaret. The Earl of Cumberland appointed men to negotiate a marriage settlement, but Guildford instead made that fateful marriage to Lady Jane Grey, while Margaret was ultimately betrothed to Northumberland's younger son, Andrew. The latter marriage never took place, as Andrew was imprisoned for his role in the attempt to divert the succession away from Mary Tudor and into the hands of Lady Jane Grey. Margaret Clifford instead married Henry Stanley, Lord Strange, the future Earl of Derby, in 1555, in the presence of Mary I and King Philip of Spain. The couple would have 4 sons: Edward, William, Francis, and an extremely exotic-sounding Ferdinando. Very unusual name for a Tudor. Despite the successes of the marriage bed, 4 sons, the stuff of dreams for Henry VIII, the union eventually broke down and the couple separated. Margaret, who was dangerously close to the throne after the demise of her Grey cousins, was later accused of attempting to employ astrology to divine the date of Elizabeth I's death and her choice of an heir. As a result of this, she spent several years under house arrest. She died in London in 1596, 7 years before the death of Elizabeth I and the House of Tudor as England's ruling dynasty. So why is Eleanor so hidden from history? There are a few ways to interpret it, but ultimately I think it comes down to 2 key things. Firstly, she lived a long way from the royal court, way up in the far north of England, and thus was not massively involved in the minutiae of court politics. But more significantly, she died young, and unlike her elder sister and her cousin, Henry VIII's other royal niece, Margaret Douglas, Eleanor did not get into any trouble, really at any point, and her children, save that imprisonment of her daughter at the very end of her life, likewise. They didn't challenge the status quo in the way that her sister, and in particular her sister's eldest daughter, Jane Grey, so resolutely did, albeit by the actions of men using their royal blood to bolster their own ends. In short, Eleanor's life was significantly less dramatic, and because she died young, any potential future drama never happened. Likenesses of Eleanor are also in short supply. There is a portrait of what is generally believed to be her, but it could as easily be one of her daughter Margaret, and so that too makes her feel all the more elusive. Whilst today she is not deemed as especially significant, this is to undercut how she was viewed at the time. If we consider that she was basically held to ransom by those at the centre of the Pilgrimage of Grace, it is clear that she was a woman with a big profile at Henry VIII's court and across England, and that the common people recognised both her importance and her royal blood. Until such a time as potentially more information about her is unearthed, we'll just have to keep in mind that there were actually 3 royal nieces at Henry VIII's court, and that one of them, Eleanor, may seem inconsequential now, but was for a time one of the most important women in England, and 8th in line to the throne, which, to put it into modern context, is more senior in the line of succession than, say, Princess Beatrice or Princess Eugenie. And with that in mind, I think it's time that we spent a bit more time exploring the lives of these overlooked figures and doing justice to the lives that they led. And so, that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. The Tudor Chess Podcast will be taking a break next week as I, alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, will be leading our in-person tour, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn. I will therefore be back the week commencing the 9th of September and have some exciting guests lined up for September, including Elizabeth Fremantle, the creator of Queen's Gambit, which has of course now been made into a major film, Firebrand, starring Alicia Vikander and Jude Law as Catherine Parr and Henry VIII, respectively. To keep up to date with everything from the Tudor Chest, please head over to my Instagram, and if you'd like to support the channel and get access to all of my additional subscriber episodes, then please head over to either my Patreon at patreon.com/The Tudor Chest, or look for the podcast in Apple Podcasts, where you can become a monthly or annual subscriber. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chest podcast, and speak soon.